turn with me to Matthew chapter 20. Well, actually chapter 19. Because one thing that we'll see is that the chapter divisions we have in the Bible are made or inserted to be helpful. But sometimes what they do is they tend to put a stopper in the story for us, and we lose the context. Or we tend to lose what was happening right before something else was to occur. But again, they are put there for a great aid. For example, if I wanted you to turn to John chapter 17 and read through Christ's prayer with me, I would just say turn to John 17, and then we know that chapter deals with Christ's prayer in the garden. That'd be a lot easier than me saying, all right, turn in the book of John to that section where Jesus is praying. Because you'd be there all morning trying to find that section. So that they have a good purpose. But what we see is they tend to sometimes put a block in the story and we lose the context. And such is the case in Matthew chapter 20 and 19. See, this morning we're going through the parable of the 11th hour workers. But in order to know the context of what's happening in Matthew 20, you need to know what happened in chapter 19 first. So with that, let's back up, starting in Matthew 16. I'm not going to read this passage, but this is a passage in Matthew 19:16 that we've all read through or studied, or you've heard a sermon on it from me at least once, twice, not 5 times, about what we call the rich young ruler. So Christ is teaching and preaching, and this young man comes to him and says, Master, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Christ says, well, just keep the commandments. Yeah, and he's like, well, which ones? And then he tells him which ones. Honor your father and mother. And then he goes through the list. And the rich young ruler is like, all right, I got this. I mean, he is excited. He's like, because I know these things. Book, chapter, verse. I went to Saturday school. I went to synagogue. I know what's going on. And then he says, is there anything else? And Christ says, well, yes, of course there is. And of course, I'm paraphrasing this. And he says, one thing you lack. He says, you need to go sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And it says that he went away sad or sorrowful. See, the cost of following Jesus was too high for him to receive the reward that he thought he deserved. The cost was too high. But we know better. Jesus then turns to his disciples and he says to them, truly, I tell you that it is impossible or extremely hard for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. All right, now, Jesus, if you're going to build a large church, you're going to need to soften that message. He then goes on to say this. It says, it is easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. So instead of softening the message, he doubles down on it. So his disciples are flabbergasted. And they say, well, then what chance do we have? And then the response is, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. But then Peter, who has been surprisingly quiet during this, he says, but we've left everything for you. Or another way of saying, don't you know everything we've done for you? Don't you know what we've given up? Don't you know the sacrifice we've made? He's almost asking or saying, Master, you know what we've done for you. Is our reward going to be even greater? And here's how Christ replies. Verse 28. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Now, let's jump over pretty please to Matthew chapter 20. And so that builds the context for where we are. Is you cannot take away Matthew 19, the rich young ruler, and you cannot take away this exchange that he had with his disciples and with Peter, and then go into this parable blind. So let's start reading, because this is also his response to them. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house, who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, 'You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you.' So they went. Going out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went and found others standing. And he said to them, 'Why do you stand here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You go into the vineyard too.' And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the laborers and pay their wages, beginning with the last up to the first.' And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now, when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more." So we're already seeing the connection with Peter here. "But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day of the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first will be last.'" So in two different sections here, in a very short succession, Christ uses that phrase, "the last will be first, the first will be last." So we automatically make this connection. There's a teaching on humility here that needs to be made. But more importantly, I want us to recognize that what Jesus is talking about here ultimately is grace. See, the key principle in the kingdom is not merit, but it is grace. And it's very hard for us to take away the merit or the work aspect when it comes to being a Christian. Songs we sang. Songs I asked TJ to lead last night that I couldn't find in the song dealt with working. And I might have overlooked them. I don't know. But nonetheless, we know that there's work to be done. But when it comes to receiving the reward from the Savior, it's not about how much we've done, but it is ultimately about His grace. So Jesus starts out by saying the kingdom of heaven is like this. So he says a landowner goes out and hires day laborers for a day's wage. Now this is the third lesson that I've given on a Sunday morning, I believe in a row, that has dealt with a denarius, a day's wage. So what you would make, in their case, a 12-hour day. And what we see is he goes out in the first hour and calls people. But then he keeps going out time and time again in certain intervals, 3, 6, 9, even up to the 11th hour. And he keeps calling more and more people to come and work in his vineyard. Now, he doesn't send someone else out to do it. He goes out and he does it himself. He is actively seeking for people to come work for him, work in his vineyard. He is out there recruiting and calling people. He's not setting up a booth and just expecting people that want to work to come to it. No, he's going out to them. And I think far too often We expect people to see us here and just show up, and that happens, and that's great, and I love that. But we cannot just sit back on our laurels and just expect sinners to want to come learn more about God. And I say that because we are all sinners. We can't expect people to just want to show up. What they need someone to go out and to call them. And we are those who are working for Jesus Christ, and we have a responsibility to do what he's done and live as he's lived, and to go out and to call others to come worship with us. Not because we want to have the most amount of people, we want a lot of people, but we know it's not a numbers game. But what we want is to share in the glory of God's grace and salvation with as many people as we can. And we have to go out and we have to find people and tell them. And I think we've been doing that, but let's never forget that is part of what our mission is. People look at us and classify us as evangelical Christians, but I think what happens is we forget to be evangelical. That's part of where our class kind of went this morning. There's an aspect of going out and telling others about Jesus Christ and his grace and his mercy, and that I, as a sinner, what he has done for me and continues to do for me, he can also do for everyone else. He leaves the comfort of his own home and he goes out to the workers. And he calls them and he gives them a purpose. And that's exactly what he has done for us. And now notice what he calls them to do. He calls them to work in his vineyard. Now that's still physical labor, which for many is, unappealing, but it's work. But the work that happens in this vineyard leads to celebration. Because what's happening is the grapes go on to make wine, and the wine is used for weddings, for festivals, for celebrations, for different days. The master is not calling them to come work in a salt mine where there's just kind of fruitless labor that ends up doing nothing. What he's doing is he's calling them, he gives them this purpose. Come be a part of this work that's going to end in a celebration. He gives them a positive purpose here. He doesn't invite them to come be miserable, but he invites them to come be part of something that is joyous and celebratory. He wants his workers to have part in that reality. As the workers that Christ has called, let us remember and never forget that the work he's called us to is not to be a miserable, unfruitful work, but this is supposed to be something that ends in a joyous occasion, that ends in a celebration, that ends in his salvation and his glory. The master urgently calls workers to a purpose. And he calls them in order to provide for them a day's wage. And he calls them later and later and later, even until pretty much the end of the workday. In verse 8, he then begins to pay his workers. And he begins to pay them with the last ones that were hired, the 11th hour workers. So 12-hour workday, the 11th hour, they worked 1 hour. Now, this is where the story kind of gets a little bit interesting. So they show up, the 11th hour workers, and he pays them a denarius, which would have been pretty much a silver coin, which would have been a day's wage. A 12-hour workday is what they were just paid for. And they had to be ecstatic. Like, we only worked for 1 hour, but yet we're getting paid for 12. This is amazing. This is wonderful. And they love the master here. They love him. They are his biggest fans. They're going out and they're bragging. Do you know what this guy just did for me? Now, I imagine there's a line here that's going through, and you can imagine the thoughts going through those that were hired, let's say, at the 3rd hour. Because, they're probably trying to do the math. All right, so if they got paid 12 hours for 1 hour, and we're hired at the 3rd hour, we are making a whole lot more, which I didn't do the math. But they had to be thinking, wow, we're going to make so much more. And so they're calling, oh, hey, go, go buy, go buy that that car you've always wanted, or we're going on this vacation, and don't nitpick and say, Matt, they didn't have cars or phones. Don't be that guy, because that's what I would do if I was listening to this. Well, they didn't have phones in the Bible days. But you know, they are just ecstatic, thinking, wow, we're going to finally, you know, we've made it. And then the next people come through line, and they are handed a denarius, a day's wage. Now, I don't have to tell you how those other workers that are down the line feel, because you're already there. And of course, as the story tells us, they begin grumbling and complaining. I'm going to ask you a question. Now, granted, I know what you're going to say because we're in church. You have to answer correctly because we're in church. Is the master fair? Thank you. Yes, thank you. No one wants to holler out. That's fine. Like, Matt, you're here to talk, not us. Yes, the master is fair. Now, granted, we're not the ones in the story either. Well, we are, but we'll get to that point later. They all received exactly what they thought they were going to receive. He said, I'll hire you for a day's wage. They said, sure, let's do this. Let's go. But then they see what's happening, and then greed starts to set in. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen that show, Shark Tank, where it's 4 or 5 successful business people all sitting in a room, wanting to invest in small businesses. So people come in with neat ideas or inventions, and they try to sell a portion of their business or this idea to get these investors to invest in them. And so they'll say, I want just let's say $50,000 for 10% of my company, and then they'll barter back and forth. But occasionally you'll see an investor that says, yes, I'll give you exactly what you wanted. I'll give you exactly what you've asked for. And almost every time, upon getting what they've asked for, they get greedy. And then, that's when the drama of the show starts to kick in. These people here are getting paid exactly what they think is coming to them, exactly what they've agreed to work for, but then greed starts to set in. They think their reward is contingent upon their merit and not the grace of the landowner. I told you this was a parable about grace, and it is. It's also a story about the arrogance of the workers. Those who think their reward should be based on on their merit for the kingdom and not the grace of the master. See, we kind of know this, or at least now you do. We are the workers in this story. God, Christ, is the master, the landowner, calling people to work for him. And just as Peter stated, we've left everything for you, expecting a bigger reward. These workers in the vineyard are expecting a bigger reward. It is easy for us as Christians, especially if you've been a Christian for a little while, to start tallying up the points of here's everything I've done for the kingdom. Here's everything I've done. Pulling Peter, I've left everything for you. I mean, I have served, I have taught, I have door knocked, I have, I know we don't have VBS here, but if you've ever taught a VBS, we have VBS 5 days a week. And there's no kind of tired like VBS tired. I mean, it's exhausting work. It's a different kind of tired. And so when we start doing that game, when we start to either compare ourselves to other Christians, well, I've done this, but they haven't done hardly anything like this. Or we start racking up the points. Here's everything I've done. Be very careful with that. Because you'll find yourself starting to divide yourself against others and filling your heart with disdain. This is a story about the grace of God and not about the merit of the workers. I was baptized when I was 10 years old, 4th grade. And so I've been an active Christian for 26 years, going on 27. And it's really easy for me to start racking up the points. And start saying, God, here's everything I have done for you. No one's immune from this. And so this parable is just as much a toe stomper for me as hopefully it is for you. So the question is, all right, so what do we do with this parable? So we have workers called in the first hour, some called at the 11th hour, near the last, and then all receiving the same amount of pay. What we do is we realize that the master has not given the workers what they've earned, but instead he's given them what they need. You see, these are all day laborers, meaning they work for a day, they get paid for a day, meaning they don't have any full or long-term employment. This is their livelihood. They're out there standing, waiting to work, saying, no one's called us. They said, if they don't work, they don't eat, very likely. And so what we see is he didn't pay these workers out of a debt to them. He paid them out of his grace. He didn't hire them because he needed them. He hired them because they needed him. He called them even at the 11th hour because he knew they needed a day's wage. 1 Peter 1:3 says that his divine power has granted us or given us everything that pertains to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who has called us to his own glory and excellence. Since God's grace has given us everything we need, but yet somehow we sit here and then start racking the points saying, God, I need or I deserve more. And God says, no, I'm giving you grace. Be happy with that. Because when we start tallying up and saying, here's everything I deserve, I don't think we're going to like what the answer would actually be. Another thing we do with this parable is that we have to realize that we are all 11th hour workers. Again, we can go through this room and we can stack up everything we've done for the kingdom over a couple weeks to months to 50 plus years. I'm certain of it. And we can talk about the blood, sweat, and tears, the money we've invested. I mean, just the heartache we have gone through on behalf of the kingdom, serving the Lord, doing a variety of different things. But the thing is, we can say, but we've left everything for you. But we are still 11th hour workers. Because following God and serving Christ has been going on for generations. I would love to stack up my 5 nights of VBS against those early martyrs. Oh, 5 nights of VBS, whew. Well, I was just torn apart by lions. Ooh. Or talk to the early Christians that were tarred and lit on fire to light Nero's courtyard. Or talk to the early apostles who, according to church history, all died excruciatingly painful deaths, with the exception of John, which I don't know why we accept John or give him an exception, because history tells us he was boiled first but survived. Because somehow we say you all get the point. We're all 11th hour workers. And what Christ is trying to teach here in the wake of the rich young ruler is he's trying to teach his disciples and to teach Peter, this is all about grace. Don't try to rack up the points. Don't try to say, I've left everything for you. Just recognize that the Master has called us all at different points in time, all of us in the 11th hour. Because it's not because he needs our work, it's because he knows we need a day's wage from him. He knows that we need him. This is ultimately a parable about grace and exactly what the Master has given us. He has called us because he knows we need him. So just as those 11th hour workers rejoice for getting a day's wage for only working 1 hour, let us also rejoice in the mercy and the grace and the goodness of our Master, who has called us at all. And let us know that that the reward that is waiting for us is greater than anything that we could ask or we could imagine. Because we know it's been given to us by him and by his divine power. Now maybe you've not taken on Christ in baptism, and you want to learn more about that. We can talk, or we can study, or we can turn on the water when we're done here. Or maybe you've kind of found yourself, like we all have done from time to time, racking up the points, looking down on others that haven't been doing this as long as I have, or haven't worked as hard as I have. Remember, we're all in the same boat together. We are all receiving his grace and his mercy and his love daily, not because we've earned it, but because he is good, and he is a good master to us. Or maybe this doesn't even apply to you at all, and you are just struggling with other things. You can seek the prayers of the church or repent right there where you are. Either way, the gospel is calling to you. Let's stand and let's sing for your encouragement.
No power of hell, no scheme of man.